We're beginning to talk about percents. So first we're going to talk about going between percents, fractions, and decimals. So I want you to go ahead and copy all this down, and then we'll go through it and do some examples. So these are your steps of how to change between each of these things. Okay, so to go from a percent to a decimal, you just take the number that's the percent, like 50%, you take the 50 and divide it by 100. Okay? So to go from a percent to a fraction, we put the percent number, like 50%, we'll put 50 over 100 because every percent is out of 100. That's why it's per cent. Think of a cent. You take 100 pennies, 100 cents to make $1. Okay? Or a century is 100 years. So you take the percent, put it over 100, and then you simplify that fraction if possible. Now going the other way, if we start with a decimal and we want to get a percent, then we need to multiply that decimal by 100. So we're going the backwards from here. To go from a fraction to a percent, that you're going to start by taking your numerator and dividing it by the denominator. So we're changing that fraction to a decimal. Okay? Then once you have that decimal, we go back up here. So we multiply it by 100, and then you put the percent sign under it, or after it. Okay? So let's look at some examples. So we want to change each of these to a decimal. So I have 90%, 17%, and 5%. So remember, to change from a percent to a decimal, we divide by 100. Well, when we divide by 100, we're actually just moving the decimal. So if we divide 90 by 100, that you could take 90 divided by 100 on your calculator, you're going to get 0.90. So notice that with 90, your decimal is after the 0. For dividing by 100, we move the decimal 2 places to the left, so you'll get 0.90. This is the same as 9/10. And I'd prefer that you write it this way because this is more simplified than having that 0 at the end. Okay? These are the same, but I would rather you write it this way. So now let's look at 17%. We're dividing it by 100, or moving our decimal 2 places. So 17% will change to 0.17. Now, let's try 5%. So you can type in your calculator 5 divided by 100. Or, if you're looking at moving the decimal, with 5%, our decimal is here after the 5. Moving it 2 places, I'm going to rewrite this. So there's our 5%, here's our decimal. Moving it 2 places to the left, we have this empty space. We need to put a 0 in that space. So 5% will be 0.05. This is different than 0.5. Okay, this is your 50%, this is 5%. So the 0 in front does make a difference. So that one's wrong. Here's your answer. Now, let's look at going from a percent to a fraction. So we're looking at each percent is out of 100. So we're looking at a part, which for 90% is 90, out of our whole, which is 100. So we have a fraction. Now all we need to do is simplify it. So we could divide each of these by 10. So 90 divided by 10 gives me 9. 100 divided by 10 gives me 10. 9/10, I can't simplify that anymore. So 90% is equivalent to 9/10. Now let's look at 17%. So you put 17 over 100, because it's just the percent over 100. Now, 17 is a prime number. It can't go into 100. And since it's a prime number, there's no factors. So this is as simplified as we can get. So it's 17 over 100. With 5%, again, we want 5 over 100. Then to simplify, we can divide each of these by 5. So divide them by 5, we get 1 over 20. So that's our simplified fraction. Okay, going on to the next one. Now we're wanting our answers to be percent. So we're starting out with the decimal 45 hundredths. Okay, so this is where, when we're going from a decimal to a percent, we want to multiply by 100. Multiplying by 100 just moves your decimal 2 places to the right. So you can use your calculator and put 0.45 and multiply by 100. Or you can look at this and go, well, I'm going to move my decimal place 2 places to the right, so it will end up being 45%. Now, for 2 hundredths, that again we're looking at moving our decimal 2 places, so this will end up being 2%. So if you take 0.02 and multiply by 100, you'll get 2. And then we just stick on the percent sign. For 4 tenths, that you can take 0.4 and multiply by 100, moving the decimal. Here we have an empty space again. We have to fill that up with a 0. So 4 tenths is equivalent to 40%. Alright, the ones with a couple steps. So we're beginning with a fraction and we're wanting to write it as a percent. So I'm starting with 3/5. So for these you want to start by taking your numerator and dividing it by the denominator. So I want to take 3 and divide it by 5. When I do that, I get 0.6. So now we have a decimal, so going back to what we had just done, we want to change this to a percent. I need to multiply it by 100, or move my decimal 2 places, and it will end up being 60%. So if we look 3/5, yeah, that's a little bit more than half. Okay? 7 tenths. I want to take 7, divide by 10, and we get 0.77 tenths. So multiplying by 100, or moving our decimal 2 places to the right, we get that it is 70%. Now, I want you, don't write this down because this is going to be wrong. That some people can't remember which order you divide. Okay? If you take 10 and divide it by 7, you get 1, again, don't write this down. So 10 divided by 7 gives you 1.428. Okay, so let's think about this. We have 7 tenths. That is not a whole. Okay, so the decimal for this should be less than 1. So if you divide this out and for your decimal you get something bigger than 1, you did it the wrong order. Okay, so here we got 7 tenths, which is less than 1. So this was our correct way. So I'm going to mark that out because that was wrong. Alright, so going back to working these out correctly, we have 13 over 25. So we want to take our numerator, divide it by the denominator. This one gives me 0.52. So multiplying by 100, or moving my decimal, I get 52%.